Welcome everyone to the highlights of the Photo Archive Part 2, Restoration, Alterations, and Destruction. My name is Carrie Pfister. I'm a photo archivist at the Frick Art Reference Library, and with my colleagues, Sarah Bigler and John McQuaid, we are going to be introducing you to works of art in the Photo Archives collection, which have been restored, altered, or destroyed, using the rich visual resources and extensive documentation contained in the records of the Photo Archive. My job is to briefly tell you a little bit about the history of the Photo Archive and Taddeo Gaddi's Madonna and Child Enthroned. So let's get started. The Frick Art Reference Library and its Photo Archive were founded in 1920 by Helen Clay Frick, the daughter of the industrialist Henry Clay Frick. The Photo Archive's collection grew rapidly through photography trips around the United States and Europe, where staff photographers or commissioned photographers photographed little-known works of art. Three of the photographers we'll be mentioning today are Mario Sansoni, Harry Burton, and A.C. Cooper. During the 1920s, Mario Sansoni photographed little-known Italian works of art around Italy, housed in private collections, churches, and small museums for the Photo Archive. In 1924, the library purchased 679 original negatives of Italian art taken by the photographer Harry Burton. In London, from the 1920s through 1980, A.C. Cooper photographed for the Photo Archive works of art offered for sale on the London art market, especially at Sotheby's and Christie's. And here are a few of the works in the Photo Archive's collection that are not illustrated in the 1930 Christie's auction catalog. Today, the Frick Art Reference Library's Photo Archive continues to grow through gifts and purchases, and currently is comprised of more than 1.2 million reproductions of works of art representing more than 40,000 artists, mainly from the 4th to the mid-20th century, trained in the Western tradition. As a result of our continued growth, for many objects in our collection, we have acquired multiple photographs of a single work of art, and in many cases, these additional photographs depict works in different physical states, such as before and after alterations or conservation treatments, examples we will be exploring today, along with examples of works that have been destroyed since entering the Photo Archive's collection. We also hold many examples of copies, versions, forgeries, and preparatory studies for well-known, little-known, and anonymous artists. In addition to the rich visual resource of the Photo Archive, also offers rich documentation that represents the essential elements of the biography of the work of art, including ownership and attribution history, data that has been amassed over several generations. Photo Archive staff continually updates this documentation based on printed sources and from information provided to us from museums, scholars, dealers, and collectors. One of the artists in our collection is the Italian painter Taddeo Gaddi, who was born in Florence around 1300 to the painter Guido Gaddi. Sometime between 1350 and the early 1320s, Taddeo began his apprenticeship with the artist Giotto. In addition to the Florence Bell Tower, Giotto is best known for his frescoes in the Bardi Chapel in Santa Croce in Florence and in the Scrivani Chapel, also known as the Arena Chapel in Padua. Today I'm going to talk about Taddeo's earliest surviving painting, dating to around 1320 to 1325, a now truncated panel cut down on all sides with full-length figures of the Madonna and Child Enthroned in the Church of San Francesco in Castel Fiorentino. Indeed, the composition of the Madonna and Child Enthroned closely parallels a work by his master Giotto, painted for the Church of the Ognissanti in Florence and now in the Galleria degli Uffizi. It is not difficult to imagine Taddeo's Madonna seated on a similar throne and also surrounded by saints and angels. The photograph of the painting I am showing was received by the Frick's Photo Archive in 1958 and records not only how the panel appears today, but also how it appeared after its restoration precipitated by its inclusion in an exhibition on Giotto at the Uffizi in 1937. Also housed in our collection are two photographs, one by the photographer Harry Burton, acquired in 1924, and the other, a detail of the upper portion by the photographer Mario Sansoni in 1928, of how the panel looked prior to the 1937 restoration. Here you can see metal crowns affixed to both the Madonna and the Christ child, and possibly some silver on the Madonna's veil around her face, which I have highlighted in red boxes in the center image. The throne is also different, overpainted in oil to appear more like an architectural niche, possibly in the 17th century. The altarpiece was possibly painted for the Company of the Laudesi, a group whose devotions were directed toward the Virgin Mary and placed by them in the Church of San Francesco. There's a long history in Italy of adorning venerated images with metal works such as crowns, and a 1563 inventory published in 1900 by Michele Cione describes the altarpiece with, quote, a silver crown, a pair of silver eyes, and a silver stream, all set on the veil of the Madonna, end quote. It is unknown if the crown on the Madonna is the one mentioned in the inventory or a later redressing, and the pair of silver eyes are not in the photograph. Described as set on the Madonna's veil, the eyes were possibly a votive offering, offered in devotion or in gratitude for a miracle. And on the slide, I'm showing a modern example of a pair of ex-voto eyes. In the 1920s, the Photo Archive photographed and acquired a number of photographs of Italian devotional images with crowns or jewelry attached. Historically, devotional and miracle-working images have been neglected and dismissed by art historians as archaic in style, of little aesthetic interest, of poor quality, or irrevocably compromised by ritual dressing up and repainting. Adding crowns to paintings was disparagingly reported in an unsigned article in the 1891 Art Journal, quote, with regard to crowns, a custom prevails in Italy and doubtless other countries, of affixing them upon pictures or statues, which are believed to have been the means of working some miracles. They are decreed with great deliberation and set up with considerable ceremony, but with small regard to the character of the image they are to honor. Every visitor to Italian churches has noticed the extraordinary effect of a crown, or the half of a crown nailed to the painted canvas. It would be impossible to imagine a worse anomaly. Fortunately, no good pictures, as far as we remember, have undergone this operation. The popular devotion has attached itself to inferior works, end quote. Thankfully, this attitude has changed in recent years, and art historians are no longer dismissing devotional images and are contextualizing the cultural activity that surrounds such works. This attitude may account for why the Gotti panel was traditionally attributed to an anonymous artist of the Sienese school. It is not until 1908 that art historians began looking more closely at the figures and attributed the panel to Taddeo Gaddi. A few scholars, such as Bernard Berenson and Richard Offner, challenged the attribution and asserted their own opinions to artists such as the Florentine painter Bernardo Daddi and the so-called master of the Poppi frescoes in the Tuscan town of Poppi. As in the case of the Gaddi, metal crowns have been removed from other paintings held in the Photo Archive in subsequent restorations, but not in every case. The 14th century Madonna of Victory in San Salvatore in Bologna, photographed by Sansoni and Nesti in 1925, with crowns on both the Madonna and Child, have later been removed. The 13th century venerated Madonna Impruneta, which was repainted in 1758, was photographed in 1925 by Broggi and has undergone multiple restorations since the photograph was taken. The Broglie photograph on the left has 3 oval stones affixed to the Virgin's barely visible crown, and she wears a necklace. In the more recent image on the right, a metal crown has been added to the Virgin's head, replacing the oval stones. This painting underwent another restoration in 2011, which removed the metal crown and jewels, and restored the painted crown, which was barely visible in the Broglie photograph. The 15th century Madonna of Good Counsel in the Basilica Shrine in Genazzano, a fresco which on April 25, 1467, was miraculously carried by a luminous white cloud from Scutari, Albania, and placed on the wall in the church, still under construction. Crowns were added to the detached fresco in 1681 and again in 1867. Today, the Madonna and Child still wear their crowns and jewels. The Frick Art Reference Library's photo archive photographs and documentation of how Taddeo Gaddi's Madonna, Child, and Throne and other devotional paintings appeared before restorations are just a few examples in our vast collection of the rich information that can be found within the photo archive. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand off the presentation to my colleague, Sarah Bigler.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Bigler. I'm one of the photo archivists here at the Frick Art Reference Library. This afternoon, I'll introduce you to works of art that have been altered. In this context, by altered, we mean changed at some point in their history as the result of some external circumstances. Rather than being restored by professionals or completely destroyed, these works underwent some sort of physical change due to decisions made by owners or auction houses. For the most part, these changes were intentionally made. A great example of this type of alteration are works of art that have been cut down. So that will be the main focus today. Cutting down paintings was once a common practice and is well documented throughout the history of Western art. The decision to cut down a painting was often the result of damage to a part of the canvas. Sometimes it was done by individual owners to suit their particular tastes, altering works to better fit certain places in their homes or even specific frames. Dealers and galleries were also frequent culprits of this, sometimes cutting down paintings to increase the potential revenue from a work of art or to make the painting more marketable. Sometimes it was even done by the artists themselves, as was the case with the Frick's own Manet painting, The Bullfight. The Frick's painting and The Dead Toreador, now in the collection of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, were once one painting. After receiving scathing reviews at the Salon, Manet cut it in half, reworking both canvases to create 2 entirely separate works. So you can see here on the screen is a reconstruction done by the Museum of Modern Art, which shows roughly the composition of the original painting. This practice of cutting down paintings was especially common with portraits. The photo archive holds many examples of portraits that have been cut down, most commonly from full length to bust length, as you see here with the example on the screen. The painting we will focus on today is a portrait by the British painter John Westbrook Chandler of the children of Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend of Stanbridge House in Gloucestershire. Painted in 1804, in its original state, this painting depicts his 5 children. From left to right, we see William, Emma, Thayer, Marianne, and Robert. Chandler also painted a portrait of their father, the Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend, a few decades earlier in 1783, and the photo archive also holds a reproduction of this image, which is what you see here. Chandler was a painter and poet working in England in the last few decades of the 18th and the first decade of the 19th century. Though much of his biography remains elusive, scholars believe that he was most likely the illegitimate son of the first Earl of Warwick, Francis Grenville. He exhibited portraits at the Royal Academy between 1787 and 1791 and was patronized by his half-brother, the second Earl of Warwick, George Grenville. Coincidentally, it's the second Earl of Warwick's wife, Henrietta, and their children, whose portrait by Romney hangs in the Frick collection today. So it's entirely possible that this portrait would have hung alongside works by Chandler in the family home, Warwick Castle, where Chandler also had a studio. After 1800, Chandler resettled in Gloucestershire, where he spent the final years of his life painting local patrons, such as the Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend and his children. The portrait of the children of Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend was consigned to Christie's Manson & Woods in London by the Gallery Thomas Agnew and Son and sold on June 15, 1923. Unfortunately, its whereabouts before arriving at Agnew are unknown. We can see the lot from the auction catalog that records the sale here that includes both the price and the name of the buyer. The annotated copy of this auction catalog and all of the others that I'll mention this afternoon are all from the collection of the Frick Art Reference Library. Looking at the details provided by the auction catalog, we can see that in 1923, the painting measured 56.5 by 93 inches and included all 5 of the children. The next time this painting came up for auction, just 1 year later in 1924, it had been cut down. It was cut to create 2 separate paintings. On the screen now, you can see where the painting was cut based on the dimensions of the 2 parts of the painting sold in 1924 and 1925. The reason for the alteration is not entirely clear. In that year, between 1923 and 1924, some damage could have occurred to the painting, or perhaps dealers or the auction house thought that smaller paintings were more desirable to collectors. Scholars may also have judged one half of the painting to have been of better quality than the other, or alternatively, we could speculate that it was possibly to increase the potential profits from the sale. It was this right-hand portion of the painting which first appeared for sale at Christie's Manson & Woods in London on July 25, 1924. It was sold as Portrait of Robert and Mary Ann, children of Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend, under some trees with a dog, and it measured 57 by 35 inches. The catalog makes no mention of any alteration done to the work. But you can see here, again, the auction catalog clearly marks that the painting was purchased by the London dealer Arthur Tooth in 1925. And then here you can see the side-by-side of the 2 photographs held in the photo archive of this painting, taken in 1923 and 1924. The next year, the left portion of the painting came up for auction on June 26, 1925. The catalog lists this painting as Portrait of William and Emma, children of Reverend Robert Lawrence Townsend, in a landscape. The catalog notes that the painting measures 56.5 by 49.5 inches, and again makes no mention that the painting was altered. And then here again, you can see this half of the painting before and after the alterations were made. Another interesting thing to note is that in the process of cutting this canvas in 2, the child depicted at the center of the composition, identified in the original painting as Thayer, has been lost. When we compare the 2 fragments with the original, we can see that the middle child is not present in either of the 2 canvases. If we look closely, we can see that the places where his head or his arm would have appeared based on the original painting have been painted over, and all visible traces of him erased. So you can see I've highlighted in this image too, where the child's arm would have appeared. The location of both paintings are now unknown, likely having entered private collections after these 3 sales in the 1920s. Providing access to images and information about works of art in private collections is one of the most important features of the Photo Archive. This access enables research to continue on works of art that are not currently or have never been available to the public. The photographs of these paintings were taken by the London photographer A.C. Cooper, who Carrie mentioned earlier. The photographs that we've seen today correspond with unillustrated auction catalogs, providing an incredible resource that allows us to make definitive conclusions, which without images would just not be possible. They guide us in visualizing the changes this painting underwent, which pose new questions and lead to interesting discoveries, such as the erasure of the fifth child at the center of the original painting. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to my colleague, John McQuaid, who will discuss two portraits by John Singer Sargent. So thank you very much, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Sarah. So far, we have looked at works of art that people have changed for stylistic or even monetary interests, and we have traced those changes over time. But some works of art are lost forever. Outside actors such as fire, weather, war, or even just the passage of time have removed countless works of art from history. While the vast majority of these works have been lost before they could be entered into the photographic record, we in the Photo Archive do have over 1,000 records of works of art that have been destroyed and otherwise cannot be studied. Today, simply choosing John Singer Sargent as an artist, we can look at two different modes of destruction and showcase the opportunities offered by the Photo Archive to study these lost works. Margaret Stuyvesant Rutherford, usually called Daisy, was an American socialite of the 19th century. In 1879, she married Henry White, the grandson of Eliza Ridgely, who you may recognize from the well-known Thomas Sully portrait. Henry became well known as an American diplomat, but all the evidence points to Daisy encouraging her husband to take up a career in diplomacy, and shortly thereafter, the couple were part of the American expat scene in Europe. Her beauty was mentioned by Edith Wharton, paying particular attention to the rosy color of her cheeks, untouched by paint or powder. And when writing about London in 1888, Henry James stated, "The happy American here beyond all others is Mrs. Henry White." One of the earliest diplomatic posts for Henry was to France in the early 1880s. At that time, John Singer Sargent was making a name for himself as the premier portraitist of the time, and his stay overlapped with the Whites in the French capital. After seeing the portrait called The Lady with the Rose, now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whites commissioned Sargent to paint a portrait of Daisy. The work we will discuss in this webinar is a likely preliminary study for a full-length portrait currently in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. After only a few sittings, the Whites had to leave Paris and travel to the south of France. While Sargent did travel to Nice to work on the portrait, he remained in Paris for the majority of his work, and when compared to the full-length portrait, the smaller portrait has been described as immediate and spontaneous, so it may have been painted to be used while Sargent was in his Paris studio. The full-length portrait of Daisy is more conventional than works Sargent was completing at the same time. Most notably, the portrait of Madame X, which eventually led to the artist leaving Paris. Today's portrait is a less formal presentation of the sitter. It is a bustling portrait with the head to one side. The brushstrokes are lighter and more natural, and they show the confidence of the artist and capture the same trait in the sitter. Done at the same time as a full-length formal portrait, this could have been used by the artist while Daisy and Henry were in Nice, or even later in Switzerland. As a diplomatic family, war and politics were always part of their story. Henry's family moved to France with the defeat of the Confederacy in the US Civil War in 1865, and then had to return after the fall of Napoleon III after the Franco-Prussian War. Henry and Daisy had two children, a son John and a daughter Muriel, and befitting her cosmopolitan upbringing, the daughter Muriel married in 1909 a Prussian count with a very Prussian name, Ernst Hans Christoph Roger Hermann Serretas. While Daisy died in 1916, her husband remained in diplomacy and was one of the 5 American signatories of the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I. One of the reasons he was chosen to be part of the American delegation was because of their daughter's marriage. Henry was thought to be less antagonistic to the Germans than other diplomats. The daughter, Muriel, features in the story, as after the death of the father in 1927, she inherited the bust-length portrait we are discussing. Her brother, John Campbell White, inherited the full-length portrait, now in Washington. And she took the bust-length portrait to her husband's family estate, Castle Bergwasser, then in German-controlled Upper Silesia, which is now part of Poland. During World War II, she remained in Castle Bergwasser, which would have sad results for both Muriel and the painting. She had sent her 2 sons to Connecticut so they would not be conscripted by the German army, and because of this, she was subject to regular interrogation by Nazi officers. In 1943, to avoid giving information about her sons, or because of the constant harassment from the Nazis, she leapt to her death from a castle window. At some point during the war, the painting left the art historical record, possibly after Muriel's 1943 suicide, but more likely in 1945, as the Soviet army advanced on the Eastern Front, the castle was completely burned. Had the painting survived to that point, it would have been lost in that fire. This painting showcases how often works of art can be lost. One painting went to the brother and is now in the National Gallery of Art, while the painting that went to the sister is now lost because of the war. Possessing reproductions of works of art that are lost is an invaluable function of the photo archive. Having an image of the lost portrait of Daisy allows us to compare to the formal portrait of the same sitter, and we see the different manners in which the artist was working when he was completing some of his most famous portraits. But not all works of art are lost due to war. In November 1938, there was a devastating fire in Hingham, Massachusetts. Among the many items destroyed in the house of Elizabeth Prescott Lawrence Emmons, including a valuable model ship, were 2 portraits by Sargent of husband and wife James Lawrence and Carolyn Estelle Mudge Lawrence. While I could not discover much about the sitters, except that Carolyn was an early practitioner of photography, which of course has special resonance for us in the photo archive. At the time of the fire, the paintings had been inherited by the sitter's daughter Elizabeth, who married Nathaniel Emmons, and keeping with her mother's artistic interests, Elizabeth was an avid watercolorist. On the night of the fire, Elizabeth was awakened by her English Bull Terrier dog, Susan, and while both woman and dog were saved, the paintings were lost. And here's Elizabeth in an ice cream advertisement with a bull terrier. And while the dog's not captioned, I'd like to think that it is Susan. But I don't bring these paintings up just as a colorful story about a heroic dog. Our photo archive notes for the Carolyn portrait mention specifically the brilliant red background. At about the same time or just after, Sargent was painting his famous portrait of Dr. Pozzi, now in the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. And this is showing his interest in the use of reds and crimsons at that time. There are no color reproductions of the Lawrence portraits, so the photo archive's meticulous color notes can provide art historical insight to Sargent's work in the early 1880s. Also, there is a human connection to objects, especially portraits of relatives. On a New England website, Kinsmen and Kinswomen, a post from 2016 showcased the Lawrence portraits. While the author did not use the photo archive, future family investigators do have that option for other works of art. And I will point out that the photo archive is not just a repository of images, but is an invaluable research tool for American genealogy. And stay tuned for a future webinar devoted to that topic. Noted in the Ancestry blog post was the difficulty in finding a reproduction of the portrait of Mr. Lawrence. Because of the photo archive's wide-reaching acquisition policies, we were able to obtain an image of the portrait from a 1925 exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The portrait of Mrs. Lawrence was reproduced in a later exhibition at the Met, so it's a bit more easily obtained. By making lesser-known reproductions of works of art, especially those lost to history, the photo archive is able to serve the art historical and other communities. Lost works of art are bemoaned by art historians and anyone interested in the past. The photo archive provides an opportunity to investigate works of art now destroyed, but with photographic evidence and now becoming more accessible in a digital format. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second webinar of highlights of the Photo Archive. Our previous webinars are available on the Frick's website and our YouTube channel. We also welcome additional questions or comments, and you can access us through the Photo Archive at frick.org email address. And for Carrie, Sarah, and myself, thank you very much. And we can now take some of your questions.